Welcome Internet to Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing an article written by Otto Kernberg in 2009 called Death Drive, A Clinical Perspective. So in this article, Kernberg is going to basically underline what he feels is at the core of the death drive. And he's going to try and imply something very important, is that it's not just some psychological / metaphysical almost concept. It's, as he says, unfortunately a very practical reality, as clinical evidence has shown that there are patients that are very destructive or very self-destructive. He also talks about, and Freud points this out, that it's not only reducible to a patient, it's sometimes a whole of society that identifies with those core elements of destructiveness. So he starts the article by explaining that fundamentally in the psyche there are two main forces. The life drive, i.e. the forces of affection, love, care, growth, and the side of aggression. He says that both are very important in our constitution, in our development, and even in our evolution, both as species but also for other species. So he makes a parallel with other mammals that basically there is a need for aggression, i.e. to protect oneself, to protect one's descendants. Basically the animals have to defend themselves. And so therefore there is aggression. And there's also aggression in man. Of course, not to the same level, not exactly in the same way, but basically for him, our aggression is basically a trait that harkens back to basically evolutionary processes within the, let's say, life itself, right? So basically for him, what's going to occur is that in those drives for aggression, at the very core, normally they're mediated by the affects of love, i.e. love kind of limits the destructiveness, the amplification or the intensity of violence, aggression, hatred. Normally it's mediated. However, there are cases, and this is what the paper is going to be about, there are cases where the violence, be it towards oneself or towards others, is so extreme that one cannot just forego the conclusion that there is no death drive. Quite the opposite. For Kernberg, these problems, these issues of extreme and intense violence are cause of concern, because you can't dismiss the idea of a death drive given the sheer intensity of certain patients. And the examples he gives are, of course, very extreme, since, for example, that are relatively rare, at least in a private practice or even in a hospital setting. For example, patients will cut off their fingers, try and rip off their arms, drink poison, how can I say, not being deceived, really drinking it as a way of self-destroying. And what he says is that in those very specific cases, well, one has to question what is happening. And so for Kernberg, what is happening in those very extreme cases, he's going to give very important details on it, is that fundamentally these people identify the world through the prism of a sadistic object, i.e. what that means is that basically relationships are seen as basically at their core as extreme sadomasochistic relations, i.e. or you're in the position of an aggressor in which fundamentally you have all the power, all the sadism, and you're going to unleash that onto the world and destroy others and corrupt them and pervert them, or you're in a position of victim. But here, victim doesn't mean that just that you undergo the experience or you try and fight against. Quite the opposite. For Kernberg, what's happening in those extreme cases is that the individual has identified so much the disposition that they're completely passive and basically they are playing a role of being destroyed because they can't imagine, they can't envision the fact of being able to break from that dynamic. Therefore, they're completely stuck and fixated. In a way, he talks about paralysis, but that's exactly what it is. Those people are completely paralyzed. And he said that the problem, the very core problem, is that given that extreme intensity, one could think that they are merely victims, as we would say, how can I say, any given therapist would try to help them. What he says is that in these very extreme cases, the very problem is that in their victimhood, they have a sense of triumph. That triumph is the fact that they make the therapist, they make the state, they make the hospital, they make the carers, they make everyone feel helpless, and they enjoy it, which is a very terrifying sight. Meaning that through their destruction, they take a form of pleasure. We would say in French, une jouissance, i.e. a destructive sense of pleasure in what is happening. Basically, they become all powerful through the engineering of their own destruction. For Kernberg, these types of people are what he calls malignant narcissists. So what is a malignant narcissism? He describes it as narcissistic individuals which have fundamental paranoid beliefs and paranoid systems of thought. They also have antisocial behavior, and they have what is called egocentric sadism. What does that mean? It means that they enjoy hurting others, and that doesn't cause any mental pain or issue. Yet it is basically how they see themselves. They see themselves as people that hurt others or are going to be hurt by others, and that causes no distress, that vision of themselves. So it's people who are very, very affected. And what Kernberg explains is that they haven't arrived at that by accident or just by biology. What is happening for them is that basically they have been in such abuse that the only two positions that they have is being the aggressor or being the victim. And it's a much more extreme form of victim, as I was saying. It's basically, at the core, triumphing over everything that's good. He talks about this idea of perversity. What he means by perversity is when all the good elements are corrupted, defiled by the individual. That the individual takes them, but instead of using them to heal, to grow, to try and leave the state of suffering, they take it, they twist it, and they reduce it to nothingness. In a way, basically, they are trying in a very pseudo-conscious way to transform the help into hopelessness, but not the hopelessness within them. They're not feeling themselves helpless. They want the therapist, they want the outside world to feel helpless towards them. They want, in a way, to make them suffer as they've suffered, meaning that basically they don't want help, and that not wanting help goes further. What they want is to corrupt the help, is to transform it, to pervert it. And in these cases, basically, they are very, very hard to help, as they don't want to get out of that position. And worse than all, what Kernberg says is that basically what they really want is to get the therapist to basically fall from his position of helper, of healer. They want to make the therapist hate them. They want the therapist to make mistakes. They want the therapist to basically join them in hell. And that's fundamentally their position. So it's not just about, as we would in normal cases, trauma, experiencing the trauma, trying to regroup the fragmented sense of self. Here, it's very interesting because in the article, it's almost as if they had no fragmented sense of self, as if they were unified in this aggression and in this hatred and in this destruction. And it's in these very extreme cases that Kernberg says that there is a death drive, that very clearly there is something that seeks to destroy not just oneself, but the others, and everyone has to be destroyed by the death drive. And that is what Kernberg basically puts forward, is that it's not always there, but when it's there, it's massive and almighty and virtually untreatable. I mean, virtually, because he does outline at the end a tentative to try and help those people. But, and this is a big but, fundamentally, this death drive is secondary. What does that mean? That means that not everyone has a death drive for Kernberg. It's only when one has identified with a sadistic object, really extreme sadistic object, that one can really call it a death drive. He also opens up, even though he doesn't go into too much detail, about the death drive within groups. When, how can I say, when there's a resort to violence, to destructiveness. And he does say that those often spring from two movements. The first and foremost, the group identifies with a leader that just gives them cliches and just basically trivializes their experience. And after they turn to a more extreme leader that basically galvanizes them, that just basically takes on the role of the superego and becomes, and where all the hatred internal to the group just gets projected onto a third party. And we can see that happening in our world right now in many countries, how the in-group basically hates and seeks to destroy. And for Kernberg, this is the expression of the death drive also, as wars, calamities, disasters, human disasters made by man, are expression of collective death drive. Here, harkening back to what he was saying for the individual, but extended upon a group, i.e. that the sadism becomes egocentric with the group. And of course, he doesn't go into a lot of details here because it's not the point of his article, but he does mention it, and it's very important and very interesting. Why is it important? Because basically it gives a link with Freud, because Freud did believe that in groups our death drive is just tremendously increased, but it's not. It's also an admission that in the very culture we are in, there is a tendency to the death drive, and I think it's very important to confront it, because it's not by denying it that we are going to go anywhere with it. It's by trying to confront the death drive that we can or may at least try something. If we deny it, if we hide our head in the sand, then the death drive is just going to come for all of us. Here, I have to say that all of what I've just said for the 2 last minutes, not Otto Kernberg, my own perspective, but Otto Kernberg has this gift where when you read him, you kind of get your own ideas and you kind of elaborate, and that's what I'm sharing with you right now. So what Kernberg says is that basically there is a death drive within the collective of mankind. He also does point out that in certain moments, those people I was talking about earlier, those malignant narcissists, can be helped through his basic 3 phases of transference. I'm just going to talk about them again because they're very important and very interesting, even though I one day will make a whole video in regards to them. The first phase of transference with these people is psychopathic. So that doesn't mean that they want to hurt necessarily the therapist. That means that basically they will want to hide everything from the therapist. They will want to present something that's conflictual. There's no worries, there's no issues. No, there's no problem. We're good. We're good and we're fine here. The second phase is the paranoid phase, where they realize that the therapist isn't gonna just to, how can I say, let things go at face value, that they're gonna investigate. That will create a paranoid reaction in which the individual will fight back, will try and push back the therapist because they're very afraid of basically having this sadistic object and this dynamic, as bad as it is, being questioned or being, in a way, basically discovered or even analyzed. So basically I'm going to push back in a very paranoid nature, i.e. thinking that the therapist is themselves a sadistic object that's just trying to see where the weakness is, to point it out and to try and push it and make them suffer. So after that phase is basically has been set up, it opens up to the depressive transference, i.e. when they realize that there is something more, that they realize that basically all of what was lost, all of what wasn't there, which is a moment that's very important because basically it's the moment where there is a hope for change, because they realize what could have been, and they realize the wholeness of the object, that the object is not just there to destroy, but can be there to love, and it opens up to that potential love and to those effects of love. And this article ends on this note of it can be done, but he does insist that the death drive still remains clinically very important to think those extreme cases, but we shouldn't use it as basically an explanation for everything. He even gives this very interesting example at the tail end of the article of apoptose, I would say in French, apoptosis, I think in English, which is basically the suicide of the cells, and that was pointed out as one of the examples of Freud being right about the death drive. He says that we shouldn't try and merge everything together, that this phenomena of cell suicide, healthy cells that commit suicide, should not be just equated with the death drive, as basically there are two very different spheres, one in the micro and the psyche being in the macro, i.e. it's the whole individual we're talking about. So even though it might be tempting, we have to really try not to, because it would be too reductive, and it would be just combining two things that are not necessarily on the same level, and it would be for him a mistake. So it's a very interesting perspective that he basically advocates for the death drive, but also he kind of nuances his argument, saying that we shouldn't just de facto go to the death drive. Also, very important with this paper is that it was a lecture Kernberg gave, and I, a couple of months ago, linked the video on this channel. I'll put it back in the description, but if your thing is more listening, here I basically gave my input on the article. But if you want to hear his own words on it and his own explanations, and also him answering the questions, I would highly recommend the video I'm going to put in the description. So fundamentally, if you have any questions, anything you'd like to ask, feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.